Well, we're blessed to be at this church. Oh, okay. So we're blessed to be at this church. And it's great to have so many people out here on a Saturday, and also those of you who are watching online. I'm going to be giving two talks today. In this one, I'm not going to talk so much about science. That will be the second talk. But I'm going to be talking, building off of what we've been hearing from Dr. Sunshine about Christians and politics. But my background is a little bit different, as you'll hear. So I'll be focusing in a little different way, but similar topics. So we'll get started. Urban crime exploded as young thugs took over the cities. Promiscuity and substance abuse were rampant. People had stopped attending church. Many professors in the nation's universities were actively hostile to Christianity, preferring to place their trust in secular fads and philosophies rather than a God who operated in human affairs. In politics, traditional religion and morality were flouted. One of the era's most influential presidents was an avowed materialist who scoffed in private at the miracles of the Bible and historic Christian doctrines. He especially hated Calvinists. Another president was the only president in our history to have murdered someone. Yet voters didn't seem to care. In fact, national political leaders invited a radical social justice activist to give a special public address to Congress, an activist who later proposed a declaration of mental independence that denounced private property, traditional religion, and marriage as, quote, a trinity of the most monstrous evils that could be combined to inflict mental and physical evil upon this whole race. Unquote. In many ways, America in the early 1800s, for that's when each of these events occurred, was remarkably like America today. Yet most historians wouldn't describe 19th century America as godless or secularist or amoral. If anything, the period is held up often as the epitome of a Christian America, when Christianity was all but the de facto religion of the culture, and when biblical ethics supplied the basis for social relations. Nor would criminologists describe the 19th century, at least the second half of it, as awash in crime. In fact, as late criminologist James Q. Wilson once pointed out, lawlessness went down in the latter half of the 19th century, despite urbanization, industrialization, and other factors typically associated with increased crime rates. So what's going on here? Were the 1800s the time of a Christian America, or godless and lawless America? Both depictions can't be true, or can they? It turns out that the first part of the 19th century was a time of remarkable spiritual, moral, and civic instability. But out of that instability came a social and political revolution that impacted every level of society. What happened in the early 19th century is commonly called the Second Great Awakening, referring to a series of evangelistic revivals that started in the Northeast, but ultimately spread all the way to the western frontier, places like Ohio at the time. But these revivals are only part of the story. They were paralleled by a massive infusion of evangelical Christians into the public square. Evangelicals across denominations organized associations to spread the gospel, share the Bible with people, reduce poverty, stop practices such as dueling, and reduce substance abuse, in this case, alcoholism. These revivals and movements for reform were controversial even among Christians, and they became one of the leading political controversies in America before the Civil War. We sometimes think that conflict over religion in public life is a new thing in America, but it really isn't. During the first decades of the 19th century, America was embroiled in a bitter debate about just how far religious people should go in promoting social and cultural reform and issues. Christians involved in public life during the era were accused of subverting Republican government and trying to take over the state. One group of citizens complained that the Christian activists were infusing a spirit of religious intolerance and persecution into the political institutions of the country, and which, unless opposed, will result in the union of church and state. I recall this bit of the nation's history, not for the reasons of historical trivia, but because I think there's something we can learn from it. The 19th century Christian reformers were remarkably successful. That doesn't mean they were perfect. Doesn't mean they're not legitimate things, as you'll find out in my talk, to potentially criticize them for. But nonetheless, there was remarkable success in bringing about cultural transformation in various ways. And I think their examples hold at least 5 lessons for how people of faith might engage the culture today. So lesson 1 is don't look to the government for solutions to all of society's problems. Prior to the Second Great Awakening, many politically active evangelicals had a tendency to look to government to promote religion. They thought that in order for religion to flourish, the government had to promote it through public days of fasting and Thanksgiving, strict laws against Sabbath breaking, and the use of tax dollars to pay the salaries of ministers. Piety had to be promoted by law. Congregationalist evangelicals in New England were some of the fiercest supporters of this view. They almost seemed to think that vibrant religion and Christianity depended on the government. Thomas Jefferson and his political party thought differently. They did not favor tax dollars going to pay ministers. So the Jeffersonians as they began to triumph in state and local elections in New England, state support for churches began to end. Disestablishment, the ending of official taxpayer support for churches, finally came even to such Congregationalist bastions as Connecticut and New Hampshire in 1818 and 1819. Now, Congregationalist evangelicals first thought that disestablishment was the end of the world. Famous preacher Lyman Beecher recalled in his autobiography that the day state support of religion was voted down in Connecticut, he had, as he said, the worst attack of depression I ever met in my life. It was as dark a day as I ever saw. The injury done to the cause of Christ, as we then supposed, was irreparable. Or was it? Beecher continued, "For several days I suffered what no tongue can tell for the best thing that ever happened to the state of Connecticut." The best thing that happened? That's right. Disestablishment, said Beecher, and I'm quoting again from him, cut the churches loose from dependence on state support. It threw them wholly on their own resources and on God. State support basically had been a crutch that had kept, in his view, the churches crippled. While Congregationalists in New England looked to government as their savior, they had little incentive to do much on their own, or more importantly, to rely on God. As a result, their churches dwindled, and in fact, Unitarianism and deism won the hearts and minds of the people in the ending decades of the 18th century and early 1800s. When the state support was removed, however, New England evangelicals finally realized that they had to get their act together. They had to be serious about discipling others. They had to be serious about relying on God. They could no longer depend on government subsidies or government compulsion. And when they recognized this, something changed. Lyman Beecher was one of the people who came to understand most clearly the possibilities of this new system of voluntary religion. He became the chief architect of what one secular historian has actually called America's voluntary establishment of religion. Beecher argued that it was futile to expect that genuine Christianity could be guaranteed by religious tests for public office, Sabbath-breaking laws, and state subsidies. If irreligion and immorality dominated society, he argued, it was the responsibility of Christians themselves to form private associations to combat these evils, to convert people, and to promote virtue. And that's pretty much what happened. Led by Beecher and many others, evangelicals organized scores of voluntary associations for evangelism, missions, and social and political reform. They formed groups to help reduce poverty, to teach reading and writing to the poor, and to prevent alcohol abuse. Still others promoted prison reform and voluntary associations for voluntary observance of the Sabbath. This multitude of private associations transformed American society in a way that government programs never could. Just one example of one of these things. Today, people think of Sunday school. That's something the church does. They don't, I think, quite realize that Sunday schools was actually a movement in the 1800s that actually had a wider goal. At a time when public education was spotty at best in many areas, especially on the frontiers, Sunday schools, as they were called, formed the backbone of education in many communities, teaching both children and adults how to read. So increasing literacy was to teach people how to read, but it's also teaching them to read certain things like the Bible or other things that were instructing them in the basic principles of Christianity and morality. By 1835, in a country that was much smaller than today in numbers of people, there were 1 million pupils in these Sunday classes. This was supported by an infrastructure of 16,000 Sunday schools and more than 130,000 volunteer teachers. These were major movements. They transformed society because people became involved relying on God, but also doing what they thought he was saying. And Lyman Beecher reflected later, they say ministers have lost their influence. The fact is, they have gained. By voluntary efforts, societies, missions, and revivals, they exert a deeper influence than they ever could have by state support. I actually think he's right, and we don't have time to go into all the differences on here, but just one little fact to get you thinking on this. Just compare the lingering differences in religious observance and belief between America and most Western European countries, some of which still have official state taxpayer-supported churches even today. In the United States, as secularized as we have become, and I don't want to diminish that, in the United States, without state-supported churches, many more Americans actually continue to attend church each week, believe the Bible is the Word of God, believe in heaven and hell, pray, pretty much whatever religious measure you want to make, than, say, the population of most Western European nations that were dominated by state churches. Now, many complicated reasons for all of that, but many historians and sociologists and others have said that they think one of the reasons for that is that we didn't have a state church. Not having a state church and not relying on the government doesn't mean that Christianity cannot heavily influence society, which we'll talk about a little more as I go on. So what might a reduced reliance on government look like today? Well, in education, I think it involves further empowering homeschools and private schools and church-based programs to teach and train young people. I mean, if you think about it, it's really sad in our society that even many Christians farm out things like sex education to the public schools or even to private schools. That is something that actually parents should be doing, and parents and also churches. And so, I think one of the areas today is what can we do to empower non-governmental options in education? And what can churches do in their own communities in places where the government has taken over things that really isn't their proper sphere? This idea of relying less on government also, I think, involves empowering more faith-based ministries to reach the homeless, prisoners, and those involved with substance abuse. For one thing, we actually happen to know that most faith-based programs that actually leverage people's deepest core beliefs are much more likely to engage in real change than a government program that simply gives them, say, in the case of homeless, housing first, which doesn't deal with their underlying issues. Overall, I think this concept also probably involves trying to level the playing field so that private faith-based charities are not crowded off the field by secular groups that get massive government subsidies. It's good to talk about private civil society, but when you have a government that actually reaches into every area of society, including massive subsidies for certain things and not others, that really isn't a level playing field. But in sum, I just want to say that private sector solutions can be more powerful than many government solutions. And so I think one of the best things we might be able to do, and we could see that in the 1800s, what Christians did, is to increase our freedom to pursue private sector solutions. Now, a second lesson we can learn from American Christians and their experience in the 1800s, I think, is to understand that politics is the sphere of common ground and common grace. Sometimes it's claimed today that Christians are illegitimately trying to impose their religious beliefs on others through government power by legislating the Bible or legislating biblical morality. Now, I've seen many Christians have a hard time answering this question and this criticism, but the answer actually isn't hard, and 19th century Americans and American Christians then would have understood why. The Bible itself teaches that the basic principles of morality and justice are written on the hearts of all people. not just those who believe in the Bible. So when Christians enter politics to defend justice or enact public policies based on moral principles, they aren't actually trying to legislate the Bible, or at least moral principles just found in the Bible. They're promoting policies for the common good that are rooted in universal moral principles that are binding on all of us, whether or not you believe in the Bible. If this sounds strange, it shouldn't. In Romans 2, the Apostle Paul clearly teaches that God wrote his moral law on the hearts of those who didn't know about the Bible. Paul's teaching provided the standard Christian understanding of morality for most of the history of Christianity. For many centuries, Christians maintained that God revealed the basic principles of morality not just through the Bible to Jews and Christians, but through his creation to everyone. This moral law, known to everyone, was often called the natural law. Augustine affirmed the existence of the natural law, so did Aquinas, so did Protestant reformers like Martin Luther and John Calvin. Referring to the Ten Commandments, Luther wrote, "What God has given the Jews from heaven, he has also written in the hearts of all men." John Calvin said something similar in his Institutes of the Christian Religion. "The law of God, which we call moral, is nothing else than the testimony of natural law, and of that conscience which God has engraved on the minds of men." In the 20th century, you'll find the same truth expressed eloquently by C.S. Lewis in his books like Mere Christianity and the Abolition of Man. Lewis did not think he was saying anything radical or anything radically new when he wrote about this. He thought he was really giving the common sense understanding that Christians had had from the beginning. Most American Christians in the 1700s and 1800s embraced this same view. That's why Christian colleges of the era, places like Harvard and Yale, yes, I do understand how strange it might sound to refer to them as Christian colleges, but in any case, the Christian colleges of the era routinely offered courses in what they called moral philosophy. Moral philosophy was understood as the discipline that showed how reason and nature teach the same moral principles as the Bible. In his college lectures on moral philosophy, the Reverend John Witherspoon acknowledged that opponents of biblical morality will often claim that their views are based on the principles of reason, but that's one reason Witherspoon thought it was so vital, as he said, to meet them on their own ground and show from reason itself the fallacy of their principles. Witherspoon, by the way, I'm sure some of you know this, some of you may not, was a signer of the Declaration of Independence and president of a little college we now know as Princeton. It's because evangelical Christians in the 1800s knew that the principles of morality can be known to everyone that they also understood that politics wasn't about legislating just the Bible. Instead, politics is an area of common ground where we can join with fellow citizens this side of heaven to pursue shared objectives. And because politics is based on common ground, it's wrong-headed to argue, for example, that modern societies are somehow obliged to adopt the laws of ancient Israel today. That some Christians occasionally make that argument. They're not. None other than John Calvin was quite clear on this point, writing, "There are some who deny that any commonwealth is rightly framed which neglects the law of Moses. How perilous and seditious these views are, let others see. For me, it's enough to demonstrate that they are stupid and false." Unquote. Calvin was not one to mince words. Moreover, because politics is based on common ground, it's okay, in fact, it's important and valuable to frame public policies in terms that our fellow citizens can understand and appreciate. This means not just basing our political arguments on the Bible. It means appealing to the moral common ground we share through the law God has written on our hearts. Now, 19th century evangelicals understood this, and when they worked, say, to end dueling or slavery or advocated humane treatment for prisoners, they offered many kinds of arguments based on the moral common ground. I go into much more detail about this in my book, The Politics of Revelation and Reason. The existence of a moral common ground allows the building of coalitions with others in politics, which is often required to achieve shared objectives. In the 19th century, many of the voluntary associations and political movements initiated by evangelicals brought together groups of Christians that previously had had a hard time with each other in the United States, like Methodists and Baptists, Presbyterians, Episcopalians, Congregationalists. These Christians had some rather sharp theological differences, but they shared much moral common ground, which allowed them to pursue some common objectives. And when it came to fighting evils like slavery in America, evangelicals expanded their circle even wider, joining with Unitarians and even religious skeptics. It's important to say that joining someone else to promote a common cultural goal does not mean that you are endorsing that person's theology. We can be what Francis Schaeffer called co-belligerents without sacrificing our unique beliefs. Today, there remains a lot of moral common ground, not just among evangelical Protestants, but among traditional Catholics and the Eastern Orthodox, and also among observant Jews and Muslims. If you doubt this, watch the YouTube video of a recent school board meeting in Detroit, where Muslim parents stood up against pornographic and age-inappropriate materials being thrust upon their children in the public schools. You don't need to be a Christian to love your children and oppose propagandizing them with pornography. In sum, the common sense approach to morality of 19th century evangelicals is something I think we can learn from today. If people accuse you of trying to impose the Bible on them, make clear that what you are arguing for is based on moral principles that apply even if they don't believe in the Bible. Third lesson. I think that something else we can learn from the 1800s is the need to defend religious liberty, which Dr. Sunshine talked about last night and some actually this morning as well. Christianity started in an empire that was hostile to it. And neither Jesus nor his apostles called for a theocracy in this world. Instead, Paul in 1 Timothy chapter 2 urges Christians to offer prayers for kings and all who are in high positions, that we may lead a peaceful and quiet life, godly and dignified in every way. In other words, we should pray for the liberty to practice our faith in our daily lives, not to impose it on others. This was the standard and authoritative teaching of the Christian church in its earliest centuries. For example, Christian writer Tertullian, who was mentioned last night, wrote, and this is one of my favorite quotes from him, so you get subjected to it, it is a fundamental human right, a privilege of nature, that every man should worship according to his own convictions. One man's religion neither harms nor helps another man. It is assuredly no part of religion to compel religion. Again, he lived in the hundreds and 200s. This was in the formative centuries of the Christian church. After the Roman Empire, Constantine became a Christian. As was talked about last night, he issued the Edict of Milan in 313, which reflected this historic Christian teaching on religious liberty. That edict declared, quote, "We resolve to grant both to the Christians and to all men freedom to follow the religion which they choose." Tragically, after this enactment of religious liberty, things sort of began to become confused, and we've heard a little bit about that last night and this morning. Many later Christians ended up embracing government power to decide theological questions in one form or another. They also advocated the persecution of both non-Christians and fellow Christians with whom they disagreed. The persecution of Christians by other Christians persisted into the early American colonies. In the 17th century Massachusetts, Baptist preacher Obadiah Holmes was tied to a whipping post and viciously whipped 30 times with a 3-corded whip. He was lucky. In the 1650s in Massachusetts, 3 Quaker missionaries were hanged. In Virginia in the 1760s and 1770s, meanwhile, dozens of Baptist preachers were jailed for running afoul of Virginia's government-established Anglican church, because they didn't have license to preach like the Anglicans did. By the early decades of the 19th century, however, state churches in America were ending, and eventually nearly all Christians in America, not just Baptists and Quakers, but all Christians increasingly understood that religious liberty is a good thing, which was, I would argue, the original Christian position. So they recaptured that. And so religious liberty is a good thing. So is a separation between church and state, so long as that separation is properly defined. Separating church and state does not mean separating either the state or the culture from the influence of people of faith. Christians can still influence government and culture, but as equal citizens under the law, exercising the same rights of free speech and religious liberty that apply to all. And that's actually what most American evangelicals in the 1800s did. That's how they acted, based on using their authority as equal citizens under the law. They did it for the most part. We'll talk about an exception. But I think we need to follow that example. In a culture increasingly hostile to Orthodox Christianity, we need to defend religious liberty. But we also need to be consistent about it. Here's where the evangelical experience in the 1800s also supplies a warning for us. Evangelicals in the 19th century were not always consistent in standing up for religious liberty. One example was their effort to compel Catholic school children to read the Protestant Bible in public schools. And still later efforts to ban tax dollars from being used to allow parents to send their children to the schools of their choice. Again, they were afraid that they might send them to Catholic schools. Those efforts, especially not allowing state funding of private schools, especially private religious schools, actually evangelicals tried to create a constitutional amendment that would have forbade that. Fortunately, they didn't succeed in that, but they did succeed in enshrining those restrictions into the laws of many state constitutions, including Washington state's constitutions. And those, what are known as the Blaine Amendment provisions, have been used to block private school choice initiatives over the past couple of decades. Now, a more recent United States Supreme Court ruling has sort of probably effectively neutered that, but one of the reasons why private school choice has had such a hard time in many states is because of these provisions that evangelicals actually fought for in the 19th century because they didn't want Catholics to be able to raise their kids in the Catholic faith. So be careful what you advocate for. It may come around and bite you later. That's one of many reasons Christians need to be consistent in advocating religious liberty for everybody. Now again, despite some exceptions, I think evangelical Christians in the early 1800s largely did abandon efforts for government-coerced religion. They focused on starting their own charities and on advocating public policies based on the moral common ground. But here's the irony, and it's another reality we need to face today. So even as Christian activists in America largely abandoned their support for government-sponsored religion, they were still attacked as theocrats by both the secularists of their era and many of their fellow Christians. These critics now claim that Christians merely exercising their equal rights was a dangerous threat to the Republic. Being involved in politics and culture at all was regarded as an effort to unify church and state or spread persecution and intolerance. For example, when Christian activists in the 1800s advocated closing post offices on Sunday so that postal employees didn't have to violate their religious beliefs and work on Sundays. So this wasn't about forcing other people to go to church. It was about basically defending the rights of those who did want to respect the Sabbath. When they did that, they were accused of seeking to unify church and state. In fact, they were trying to defend religious liberty. When many Christians during the same period urged the federal government to honor the treaty rights of the Cherokee, they faced similar accusations of fusing church and state. In reality, they were defending the basic human rights of the Cherokee. Even purely non-governmental initiatives by private groups by Christians in the 1800s were attacked as a danger to the Republic. In 1828, for example, Pennsylvania's state legislature denied the American Sunday School Union a simple charter of incorporation, something that was normally granted to charitable and religious groups without favoritism. The Sunday School Union, you will remember, promoted literacy and taught poor children to read, but it was now accused of being part of a sinister plot to destroy liberty and combine church and state. Christian reformers at the time understood that these new charges of Christians promoting theocracy were false and cynical. They were an effort to deny some Christians their equal rights as citizens. The Reverend F. Freeman argued in a pamphlet that these accusations that Christians were now promoting persecution and intolerance simply by exercising their equal rights were ridiculous. This cry of persecution itself is the bitterest persecution, he declared. This charge of intolerance is the very hand of intolerance itself, stretched forth with unrelenting grasp. Christians in the 1800s learned how to navigate this situation and defend themselves in the public square by asserting their equal rights to participate in public life under our Constitution. And I think that's something we need to do as well today. Lesson 4 that we can learn from Christians in 19th century America is to beware of, not the Ides of March, but beware of utopianism. The Bible makes clear that God alone is the one who will usher in the restoration of all things at the end of the age. It also teaches that all of us are sinners and fall short of the glory of God. These two truths have significant implications for Christian involvement in politics because everything is tainted by sin, total depravity. Everything is tainted by sin, including ourselves. We shouldn't expect perfection through efforts in politics or society. That means we shouldn't propose policies that assume perfection is possible or that ignore the realities of human nature. And we shouldn't be disillusioned if things don't always go the way we planned. Disappointment, I'm sad to say, is a natural part of politics and the rest of human life. American Christians faced this challenge of our fallen reality throughout the 19th century as they confronted issues such as slavery and alcoholism and poverty. Lyman Beecher, again, was someone who understood the dangers of utopianism. In one of his earliest sermons on reform, he discussed the possibility that reformers would not achieve all their goals. And he warned his listeners about adopting an all-or-nothing attitude towards political and social change. We are not angels, but men, he declared. If we can gradually improve ourselves and improve the society in which we live, though in a small degree, it's an object not to be despised. In other words, we must be realistic about what we can achieve in this life. And even small changes in the right direction can be better than no changes at all. Other Christians sometimes had a hard time dealing with the realities of the fall or the proper scope of government power in a sinful world. For example, one group of conservative Presbyterians in the early 1800s argued that Christians could only participate in a governmental system that explicitly recognized Jesus Christ as king. And because the United States Constitution failed to do that, they decided that both holding office and voting in America was immoral. Okay? Among other things, I'd say that's utopian thinking. And if you read the Bible from the Old Testament to New, you will recognize that God's people often have been called to participate in public life in situations where godly people weren't in charge. Think the situation of Daniel, among others, and where the true God was not honored. Some other Christians in the 19th century similarly pursued a scheme of imposing by law a prohibition on the sale and production of alcohol. Put aside for the moment that the Bible doesn't actually command complete abstinence from alcohol. I'm saying this as someone who actually is a teetotaler and who doesn't drink, but I nevertheless recognize that this is not something that the Bible commands. In any case, the constitutional amendment enacting prohibition that was ultimately enacted in the 20th century because of Christian activism in the 19th century failed at many levels and was repealed. I'd say one of the problems there, again, it didn't take into account the realities of human nature. Not everything can be established through law. I mean, even if prohibition had been biblically right, I think there were some legitimate reasons why you wouldn't want to impose it by law. The sinfulness of humanity is another key reason why I think no Christian should ever want theocracy in this life. Let's be clear, theocracy today would not be ruled by God. It would be ruled by sinful human beings claiming the authority of God, and there is a vast difference. Think about your not-so-favorite elected officials right now. I will leave the choice of who they are to your imagination. But get them clearly in mind. Now, think about this. Do you really want that person or them to regulate what churches are orthodox and what aren't? And what churches should be supported by the government and not? Calvinist Congregationalists in the early 1800s Massachusetts found out the downside of theocratic government firsthand. They had been the biggest supporters of voters being able to create a state-supported church in each parish, each jurisdiction. And that was great, as long as the voters agreed with them. But when Unitarianism swept through Massachusetts, Unitarians who deny that Jesus is God, deny the Trinity, voters in the parishes increasingly removed Orthodox Trinitarian pastors and clergy in church after church and replaced them with Unitarians. And that's where the tax dollars now went. Through the force of government, Bible-believing members of churches and their ministers lost their church buildings and property because it was at the whim of the voters. One disenchanted Orthodox Calvinist wrote, "Church after church was plundered of its property, even to its communion furniture and records." A desire for theocracy in this life is animated by a false and utopian view of what humans can actually achieve in the fallen world. Now, there's a more subtle form of utopian thinking that I also think we need to be wary of, especially today. This is the idea that a Christian can only support Christian political candidates or candidates who are personally moral. Now, do I think it's good to have politicians who are personally moral? Yes, sure I do. The problem is that in the real world, you may not have that choice. And more than that, our ability to discern the state of a politician's heart or personal life is harder than you may think. I'm going to say something here that may be controversial among some of my friends in Texas, who, if you're watching online, I mean, I can hear from you later. Texas is a great state, and I love to visit there, have friends there. But in Texan politics, virtually everyone claims they're a Christian, which means in reality that many of them probably aren't. Demanding personal piety and morality above all else of your politicians ends up being utopian. If you make that demand, you aren't necessarily going to get more pious and moral politicians. You will get more hypocrites. Now, don't get me wrong again, character does matter, especially all other things being equal, but private character is not always easy to determine, and you need to realize this. Personal character is one of those things that political consultants are paid big bucks to manufacture and to tear down, depending on who's paying them. A candidate's public character, his or her positions on issues, whether they follow through on their public promises, whether they tell the truth about their policies, are probably better reasons to vote for someone than whether you think they are a good and moral Christian, because the latter thing you may not really even know. Or, even if they are a good and moral Christian in their private life doesn't guarantee that their public policies will be just and good. In 1976, many evangelical Christians in America voted enthusiastically for Jimmy Carter because he was a self-professing, born-again Christian. And I think Jimmy Carter is a sincere brother in Christ, although I disagree with him theologically on a number of issues. But I'm not questioning his sincerity. But what many Christians didn't bother to notice at the time, when they voted for him, was that Carter's economic and social policies were the opposite of what they probably regarded as wise and good. So they got what they voted for, a personally pious man with lousy public policies. The nation suffered as a result. Okay, fifth and final lesson for good measure. Don't let your faith be co-opted by anyone. There are many pitfalls to Christians becoming involved in public life. A big one is the temptation to allow your faith to be co-opted by movements and politicians that have their own agendas, which may not be quite the same agenda that you have as a Christian. Pretty soon you may find yourself roped into supporting things or adopting rhetoric that may not be consistent with your faith at all. Now, finding common ground and working together with others are good things, unless they cause you to become so partisan for a cause that you end up doing things you shouldn't, or compromising your core beliefs, or doing things that, in the wee hours of the morning, you end up being deeply embarrassed by. Christians in early 19th century America learned this the hard way. By the early 1800s, there were two main political parties in America. The Federalists, the party of George Washington and John Adams, and the Democratic Republicans, the party of Jefferson and Madison, the forerunner of today's Democratic Party. During the 1790s and through the first years of the new century in the 1800s, many conservative evangelicals allied themselves with the Federalists against the Jeffersonians, who they thought were godless. During these years, some ministers virtually became party hacks, demonizing members of the other political party and using the pulpit to generate support for the political agenda of the Federalists. Congregationalist Christians in New England were basically fused at the hip with the Federalists. In the election of 1800, in fact, many evangelical ministers presented the presidential election, and these are actual quotes from a minister at the time, as a stark choice between God and a religious president, meaning John Adams, and Jefferson and no God. Okay. There actually were valid reasons, I think, for Christians to choose Adams over Jefferson, but describing the election as a choice between God and no God wasn't actually quite accurate. Federalist clergy made it sound like Adams was a devout Christian and that's why you should support him. Again, I don't think that's adequate reason to support someone. But in reality, it turns out that Adams and Jefferson pretty much had the same beliefs. We know this now because of extensive private correspondence they had later. They both, for example, rejected the Trinity and, in fact, ridiculed it in their private writings. Neither believed Jesus was God. Now, Adams did consider himself, I would say, a Christian despite rejecting the Trinity, although so did Jefferson in private writings. But again, they redefined it in a way that, say, most evangelical Christians today would not accept as certainly biblical Christianity. I certainly wouldn't. And it is true that Adams hid his beliefs better than Jefferson. So most ministers at the time probably didn't know his true beliefs. But they were so inflamed by partisanship that they allowed themselves to be roped into falsely holding someone up to be something they weren't. And again, there were other valid reasons, I think, that they could have argued what they did. But by roping this in as a choice between this godly president and godless person, I mean, they were really doing things that they basically allowed themselves to be used as a party tool. There were other Christians later in the 1800s who fell prey to the same temptation. In the 1830s, President Andrew Jackson, who I still hear praised today by certain Christians because he quoted Bible verses and things. Andrew Jackson, by the way, is the only president, he's the guy I mentioned, who actually murdered someone. And I'm not saying this this is not metaphorical. He murdered someone in a duel that he challenged because he was upset with something the person said. I'm saying that's not honorable. In fact, Christians at the time did not support dueling, but he killed someone in a duel. But more than that, he was instrumental in pushing through his Indian removal bill. The bill was designed to expel the Cherokee from their treaty lands in Georgia and force them to relocate further west in what became known as the Trail of Tears against their will. The Cherokee had been promised their treaty lands forever by the federal government. And if you read the Bible, as well as understand the natural law, making a promise to someone, making a treaty, that's one of the, you swear it to your own hurt, it talks in the Bible. You don't break it. The Cherokee had done everything we asked. They adopted a democratic reform of government, actually Democrat-Republican form of government based off of the US Constitution. Many had become Christians because you had a great number of particularly Presbyterian Reformed missionaries among them. Many became Christians. And it was the Christian missionaries among the Cherokee who came to their defense. And most evangelical Christians in America did try to defend their rights. But Andrew Jackson's War Department organized a front group of other Christians, including clergy, to publicly advocate as Christians for breaking the Cherokee's rights and for ejecting them and Cherokee removal. These Christians basically allowed themselves to be employed as mouthpieces for government propaganda on behalf of an immoral piece of legislation. Their partisanship led them to compromise their Christianity. And this has been a common challenge for Christians throughout American history. It's a common human challenge that we've faced. It's always a temptation to conflate our worldly desires and ambitions with our call as Christians. It's always a temptation to allow our faith to be used as a tool to sell policies that may not be Christian at all. I think we need to remember that, as Paul says to the Christians in Philippi, our citizenship is in heaven. We can and should make common cause, again, on common issues. But we should never allow ourselves or our faith to become mere political props or tools. A Christ-believing and following Christian's ultimate allegiance is to Christ. It's not to Republicans or to Democrats. It's not to a race or ethnicity. As Paul says in his letter to the Colossians, here there is no Gentile or Jew, circumcised or uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave or free, but Christ is all and is in all. A Christian's ultimate allegiance also is not to nationalism or to globalism. In our own time, we need to be careful, I think, especially of politicians who try to hijack the Bible to support policies the Bible and the historic Christian tradition clearly do not support. This is one thing I think the church really does need to do when you have people in politics abusing scriptures and claiming this is what they teach to promote things that don't. I think they should be called on that. Right now, for example, as I speak, a gubernatorial candidate in California is campaigning using a Bible verse to promote abortion. Need an abortion? The candidate's ad says. California is ready to help. Learn more at abortion.ca.gov. The statement is followed by Mark 12:31, and it identifies it as it. Love your neighbor as yourself. There is no greater commandment than these. Okay. In the governor's race in Florida, meanwhile, a candidate is citing the golden rule from the Bible as a justification, just did this in a debate a few days ago, for allowing doctors to cut off the breasts and sex organs of otherwise physically healthy children. That's the golden rule. In my view, Christians who support candidates who twist the Bible like this rather than calling them out are letting their faith be co-opted. Of course, we all, and yes, I'm including myself here, we all need to look in the mirror to make sure we ourselves are acting in a way that's consistent with our faith when it comes to politics. In the 1800s, I think we can learn again from that, there was a backlash eventually against the harsh partisanship among some Christians that got too caught up in the partisan moment. And there was an increasing recognition among some religious leaders that Christians in politics had not lived up to the requirements of their faith. They had to guard against the dangers of pride and hatred, even while striving to stand up for the truth. So this is not about compromising your stand for the truth, but it's how you do it. And Timothy Dwight was one of the people who recognized this. He was president of Yale, which again, at the time was a Christian college. Dwight himself had been one of the fiercest critics of Jefferson. And one of the really towering intellects in evangelicalism at the time. In fact, so much he was called like the Pope of Connecticut or the Pope of New England because he was such a dominating intellectual and spiritual presence. And he had been a staunch supporter of the Federalist Party. And he never gave up his, really being articulate and speaking truth in society. But he came to realize the dangers of tying Christianity so closely to party politics. And he began trying to reflect on that and sort of give his wisdom to the next generation about maybe something they should try to avoid. In his commencement address of 1816, he told the graduating students this, and now I'm doing really an extended quote from his speech. "The prejudices, the fervor, and the bitterness of party spirit are incapable of vindication. I may be permitted to think differently from my neighbor, but I'm not permitted to hate him merely because he thinks differently from me. Our countrymen have spent a sufficient time in hostilities against each other. We have entertained as many unkind thoughts, uttered as many bitter speeches, called each other by as many hard names, and indulged in as much unkindness and malignity as might satisfy our worst enemies, and as certainly ought to satisfy us. From all these efforts of ill will, we have not derived the least advantage. Friends and brothers have ceased to be friends and brothers, and professing Christians have dishonored the religion which they professed." Now, one of Timothy Dwight's students from a few years before was a young man named Jeremiah Everts. Of all the politically active evangelicals during the early 1800s, perhaps Everts was the one who displayed the most clearly, I think, during this period, a reconciliation between personal holiness and political action. And it's really sad that people don't know about him. I think he's actually of the stature that William Wilberforce was in England, and we should know Jeremiah Everts, E-V-A-R-T-S, as well as we know about William Wilberforce. Everts was a lawyer, a journalist, a missionary leader. He was active in taking a stand on issues like slavery and alcohol abuse before those issues were popular to take stands on. But probably his greatest legacy was his defense of the treaty rights of the Cherokee in Georgia. It took years to actually force the Cherokee to move, and the fact that it took years was largely due to the efforts of Jeremiah Everts and his missionaries, friends. His activities on behalf of the Cherokee actually literally drove him to exhaustion and death. He did not pull his punches in his defense of the Cherokee. He was articulate, crystal clear, unflinching. He was no wallflower. Yet, many of his opponents ended up respecting him. And an indication of why they did so can be seen from his daily prayer list that some of his friends found among his papers at his death. Everts prayed daily, it turned out, that he would be, now quoting from his prayer list, would be preserved from rash and imprudent speeches in regard to the government, and pleaded for help with avoiding self-righteousness. Whenever I hear of sinful actions, before I say a word by way of censure, let me remember how much I find to blame in myself, though under so great advantages. I think Everts was a powerful example of how you can stand up vigorously for what one believes to be right and still do it in a really God-edifying, Christ-edifying Christian manner. He was an example of what the Apostle Paul called speaking the truth in love, avoiding the twin wrongs of self-righteousness and cowardly compromise. Everett showed what it truly means to be a person of faith in politics. And I think we can all benefit from his example. Thank you.